Hello, this is Warren Bird, Research Director at Leadership Network. I'm talking with Dave Travis, the CEO, Chief Executive Officer, and Chief Encouragement Officer at Leadership Network, about Everett Rogers, whose theories about innovation underlie a lot of what I do. And in fact, here's a picture of Everett Rogers. And Dave, welcome. And you met him in person. What was he like?
Yeah, Warren, I met him in person several times, actually. First of all, in his office at the University of New Mexico, where I had corresponded with him and happened to be out at a Leadership Network conference and dropped by his office at his invitation to sit down and talk with him about some of his theories and about how he could help Leadership Network with some of his theories. I'd been turned on to Rogers by both a couple of our founders, Fred Smith and Bob Buford, who had read his work, and then also Jim Collins, who I had met a couple of years before in 1996, had said that the proper understanding of Everett Rogers' diffusion of innovation was absolutely critical for the discipline of innovation. And so that's kind of how I got turned on to Dr. Rogers.
Okay, so here's a professor who writes in his opening story in Diffusion of Innovation, I think is about potato farming and the analogy that he learned from there. How did someone who does these theoretical ideas about nothing related to the church directly, how did he become so influential in church innovation?
Well, let me correct one thing. It wasn't potato farming. It was actually corn farming, where he did his initial research and the distribution of hybrid seed corn and how that innovation was spread across Iowa. He did his PhD work and graduate work at the University of Iowa and was assigned to work with an experiment station there, and that's how he got interested in this. The book that was originally released in 1962 was a way that he codified much of the communication theory that related to the diffusion of innovation. And beginning in 1962, that book was ultimately revised 5 times, and he kept adding in new learnings, new things that were going on in the field, and it became one of the codifiers of some of the diffusion research that was going on at the theoretical level and at a very practical level. How did it become so influential in churches? I think the only way it would have ever crossed over to much of the church world is just in the fact that Leadership Network used it as part of its grounding theories for how it would do its work. And we began to share some of the ideas. That later got picked up by many other organizations, especially the diffusion curve, which I think we're going to talk about later. And so that's how it really came to have an impact in the world of churches, at least evangelical churches.
So have there been successors? Are there other writers today who focus on innovation, especially as it applies to churches?
I don't know about innovation in churches. There's lots of innovation in churches, books written, but they tend to focus on one practical thing or one particular area of innovation. The theory that Rogers developed has been picked up by many other writers. It was picked up by Malcolm Gladwell in The Tipping Point. It was picked up by Jonah Berger, who is a professor, but writing in a more popular style in a book about contagion or contagious effects. There are still, of course, many professors that are writing to scholarly audiences across the world. One of the ones that I follow is actually a scholar in Australia. His name is Tim Kastelle. His blog is called the Discipline of Innovation. It's very much worth following. Eric von Hippel at MIT is another writer most closely associated with innovation. Has published several kind of scholarly works, I think, that are out there. Also, Leadership Network was greatly influenced by the work of Jerry Sternin, of which eventually a book came out a few years ago called The Power of Positive Deviance, which also borrows some of the theories of Rogers and applies it in a slightly different way. That book was co-written by his wife and also a professor, I think, at Harvard. Both Sternin and Rogers, of course, are now dead, and are no longer with us. So Eric von Hippel is still very active and still writing to a variety of audiences. And Tim Kastelle is a fairly young professor down in Australia. So I can't remember now your question, but those are some of the other writers that are writing in the field now, not necessarily about churches, but about the discipline of innovation and how it's spread across the system.
So do you disagree with anything that Everett Rogers wrote, especially about that bell curve and where the diffusion of innovation is and the different levels of innovation and percentages of innovation? And in particular, where do we at Leadership Network most closely align with his theories? So disagreements and agreements.
Yeah, I can't comment on all of Rogers' writings, and he even changed his mind, I believe, on a few things as the book went through various editions. So I'm not going to comment there, and I certainly didn't read all of Rogers' papers along the way. However, I will say this. The theory, and I agree with this theory, is really based on a mathematical distribution of organizations in a social system. And so his percentages, 1.5% innovators, 13.5% early adopters, then up to the average or the mean, and then the latter two categories, late majority and laggards, were based on mathematical percentages. And what he did was he just took the theory and overlaid based on a mathematical distribution. He never said these were exact percentages, though I think they're pretty close, and I think they serve as useful signposts. The other thing that I think what we have really focused on at Leadership Network is, of course, what we say are the innovators and early adopters. And in that early adopter category, there's a special class of innovators known as opinion leaders. And the opinion leader piece is, I think, the vital few that influence the many because of their opinion leadership in the system. So I think that's vitally important, and that has really influenced our work, is not just to work with the innovators, but also the opinion leaders who are early adopters, who take what many of the innovators do and make it practical and useful for others to follow behind.
Great. Anywhere we diverge with him in particular, and here's this book, Diffusion of Innovations, 5th edition.
I don't know about diverging, but like I said, there's several theories other than diffusion of innovation that have been very helpful in our work. And I would point to the positive deviance theory, which is a subset of this, which basically says find the positive deviance that others can go see and follow and track with and learn from. And so back to the book, The Power of Positive Deviance, or many people would want to Google up the Fast Company article, I think it was around 2000, about Jerry Sternin and his wife and their work in nutrition in Vietnam.
Well, without wanting to sound presumptive, how can we improve our work on his theories and with his theories?
I think the key for Leadership Network, or the key for denominations, when we did our workshop with Dr. Rogers in Colorado Springs back in the late 90s, we invited church consultants and denominational leaders. And many of those attended. I think there were over 100 attendees of that. We also had some local church leaders who tended to be a little frustrated, and I'll explain that in a minute. But the denominational leaders, as we gave the stress, we said, focus on the innovators and early adopters. And that seemed a little contrary to most denominational mindsets and leaders, because they felt their role was to focus on everybody or to serve all the churches within their tradition. And what Rogers was saying was that, well, you can serve all of them, but if you focus on these earlier two categories and help them to be the teachers and the transmitters of new practices, you'll be more successful. Of course, that was a very frustrating and new thought at the time for many denominational leaders. Now, the reason church leaders were frustrated was they were trying to apply this theory to their own local church. And Rogers very much disagreed. He cautioned constantly. He said that you can't look at your own local church and classify people into these categories. His contention was this was about organizational systems and organizations within a social system that you had to apply it over.
Great. Now, here from the book is his Diffusion of Innovation table. It's very simple looking, and if you Google Diffusion of Innovation under Google Images, you'll see much more elaborate and artistic and appealing versions of it. Dave, that early adapter, innovator,
Early
language,
adopter, yeah.
early adopter. Thank you. Language is with us and with so many. Is there any one, if someone were to say, okay, tell me the core idea, summarize these 500 some odd pages with the most applicable principle to churches, what would you say?
There's a section of the book that I think is the most pertinent. I cannot summarize the book in one sentence or one thought, but about innovations being observable and triable. And there's a section there about why certain innovations are adopted so quickly and why some are not. I think many times the more complex things are not adopted just because it just seems so complex. And so I would encourage readers of the book, and it is worth your time to slog through and to work your way through, to look at that about why certain innovations are adopted by a church or by a social system. I do think some of those principles can apply to church leaders that are working within, especially a larger church, to see which practices are more quickly picked up by participants than others.
Excellent. Dave, you've done a couple blogs about this that can be found by your name, Googling your name, and Everett Rogers, and so that people can make them more accessible. I've been talking with Dave Travis, CEO of Leadership Network, and a student and a personal friend, somewhat, of Everett Rogers. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.